Today, I'm joined by one of the most credentialed guests I've ever had on the show. I'm joined by Dr. Nathaniel Danjibo. He's an associate professor at the Department of Peace, Security, and Humanitarian Studies at the University of Ibadan. Now, full disclosure, during my postgraduate program at the University of Ibadan, I had the privilege of taking some of his classes. And I should say that every class with Dr. Danjibo was an opportunity for me to learn about the world, to learn something about philosophy, about economic thought, about political thought. And I couldn't think of a more credentialed guest to have this conversation with today. Welcome to the show, Doctor. Today, I want us to talk about the history of terrorism in Nigeria. Now, like many people, I got to know Boko Haram around 2009, 2010, when they started bombing churches, mosques. There was a Yanyan bombing, there was a United Nations bombing. So at that time, it was strange to many of us, So could you give us like an overview of the coming of age of Boko Haram?
Well, sectarianism is part of the experience of Islam in general. We must acknowledge the fact that Boko Haram's intention initially was not to mutate into a terrorist group. It was just one of those fundamental movements that sprang up in Nigeria. In Islam, you have two traditions. You have the Sunni and then you have the Shiites. Along the line, you have the splintering, and depending on what part of the Islamic world, the literature or what Western scholars will refer to as the Islamic world you belong to will reflect the kind of sectarian movement you also belong to. The Arabs in Saudi Arabia are mostly Sunni Arabs. And then you have the Arabs in Iran, in Iraq, who are mostly Shiites, part of them in Lebanon and part in Syria. And if you recall, just for the noting, there was a prophetic prediction, a prophecy by the Prophet of Islam himself, who for a long time prophesied that after his, exit, when he exited the world, that Islam will be divided into 72 groups, sects, and then emphasize that out of the 72, only one will be 10 miles. And so you now have some kind of confusion about the springing up of different sectarian movements. In Nigeria here, you had, the two traditions, the Tijaniya movement, which is mostly like, in those days, it was, you find them mostly in Kano and part of, so you find people like Muhammad Sanusi, the Emir of Kano. He's actually a leader of the Tijaniya movement today, Then you have the Derika movement, which is mostly around Sokoto and whatever. But over the years, you had some kind of radicalization springing up in Islam. In 1978, you had Sheikh Suleiman in Jos, who actually came with a new thinking in Islam. And that was because he realized that innovation was coming into Islam, the practice of Sunni Islam. And so he came with a movement known as the Izala. The real name was Izalatul Bid'ah wa Iqamatus Sunnah. Izalatul Bid'ah wa Iqamatus is that, look, we should resist any form of innovation coming into the real practice of Islam, which is Sunni or Sunnah, the traditional Islam as practiced in the days of Prophet Muhammad and his people. And so they realized that maybe technology and some new innovation. Now what Islamic scholars generally fail to understand is that every religion is practiced within an era and also within a culture. And you would not say that people should not use loudspeakers and technology and what I mean, or new innovation, although the principle behind the Izalatul Bid'ah was that rejecting, innovation into Islam was that they saw some forms of innovation that are coming into Islam. For example, People will be celebrating birthday, extravagant and flamboyant. People will be doing funerals like in Yoruba land, even if they are Muslims, celebrating funerals like flamboyantly. Yeah. Bringing some kinds of things that they didn't think was the right thing the president, thwarting the original principle of Islamic practice. So Izala Tubida became so famous, as anti those who were trying to bring new things into Islam that were not there. It was now popularized by Sheikh Abubakar Gumi, the father of this Gumi that is there.
Yeah.
Now, Sheikh Abubakar Gumi, as a matter of fact, a lot of people, even in northern Nigeria, think that Gumi was the founder of the Izala to Bidia Wa Ikamata Sumo group. He wasn't. He was actually Sheikh Suleiman in Jos, So, the thinking of political Islam, we need to bring a new revolution to go back, to take us back, So it's like, just for noting, you had a group called ISIL.
Yes, that's
good. The Islamic State of Iran, Iraq, and Levant. And their own business as a terrorist group was that they wanted to go back to how the Islamic community was in the days of the early Iraqi Muslims and Levant. Levant in history has faded, that kind of a thing. So they wanted to go back. So that's the kind of thinking that came. And then over time, of course, other groups started coming in, So you have Sheikh El-Zakzaki, for example, who, even though started as a Sunni person, now moved away and then embraced the Shiite type of Islam and then created a faction within the Shiite movement known as the Islamic Movement of Nigeria. They understand. So you have a lot of Shiites in northern Nigeria, from Sokoto to Kano to Bauchi to whatever, who would not associate themselves with, the movement of El-Zakzaki. They understand. So it was in that spirit that Muhammad Yusuf, a young man that was craving for more knowledge and new thinking, and that is why he actually named his group. You know what I mean?
yes.
His group was a Sunnah movement. That means going back to tradition. And that was because he associated himself with scholars who were mostly of Izala line. You know what I mean? Most of the scholars that tutored him, like trying to remember Shekau, but his own group later killed in Kano, was more of the Izala guy. So he got tutored by this radical Izala, Islamic sectarian thinking, So when he was in Kano with Sheikh, I'll remember, Sheikh Jafar. He was in Kano with Sheikh Jafar and learned the rubrics of the Izala kind of Islamic thinking or sectarian thinking with Sheikh Jafar. And then he felt like Sheikh Jafar was a bit more, a liberal type. And Maiduguri, for example, attracted a lot of Islamic scholars who used to go there to preach. Just like you have all these Pentecostal pastors moving from one place to the other, they go on crusades, kind of. You know what I mean?
Yes.
That was how Maiduguri was to most Islamic scholars in northern Nigeria. So the Ndimi Mosque in Maiduguri was this epicenter of, great Islamic scholars coming not even from Nigeria, from Chad, from Mali, from all parts of, West Africa, to preach in that mosque. And of course, it was one of the aspirations and desires of the young Muhammad, who, to a large extent, wanted to have that. It was like a new hijrah that was not looking towards Saudi Arabia, but was looking towards Maiduguri as the East. You know what I mean? So he had that desire. And so he migrated to Maiduguri, though from Yobe State. He migrated to Maiduguri. And then the great Islamic scholars would not allow him preach in that mosque because they felt like He was too radical too radical a young man in his thinking. And that was why he now moved out of Maiduguri and then went to the outskirts to establish his own base, So that was how he started, the movement. You know what I mean? Lead the Awat is well jihadi. Is that what I mean? So Ja'amatu al-Sunnah, lead the Awat is well jihadi. So the literal meaning is that this is a congregation of those who want to practice the original, that's Sunnah, Islam, through evangelism. Da'wah in Arabic means evangelism. Through evangelism and combat. So, wal jihadi. So, Islam, Ja'amatu, Ahlul Sunnah, lead Da'wah is wal jihadi. So, we want to form our own congregation, but it's rejecting other teachings that are not the original or true teachings of the Prophet of Islam, through evangelism and combat. The combat is a bit intricate, because he used the word jihadi. The literal interpretation of jihad that most people come to associate or to understand is that of violence, fight, war. But that is not actually the case. Because the jihad in Islam has 9 principles, and you start with the self. So fight to overcome your weaknesses. That is how, do you understand? Then you introduce that kind of lifestyle, virtuous lifestyle to the community. That is where it goes. And then violence or war was just the last resort. You see? So he formed that group. But because in his own preachings, and of course, because there had always been conflict between religion and science, for example.
Yeah.
For example, he rejected completely the fact that the earth is spherical. She said the earth is flat. So going back to the old Ptolemaic philosophy, because of, natural thinking. Then he, came with his own preachings rejecting scientific interpretation of eclipses, for example. He will tell you that the eclipse of whether the sun or the moon is as a result of the sin of the world. You know what I mean? So no geoscience in it, they said. So those kinds of literal interpretation and understanding of religion, do you understand? But he did something that was very innovative. His organization became very, very charitable. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So he assisted, in amongst the Kanuri, for example, it takes a whole lot of wealth to marry a Godi. And then he came and said, no, Islam didn't, allow that kind of a thing. So he kind of simplified the thing, brought in charity, his base became homeless to several homeless people. You know what I mean? Married a lot of young people who didn't have resources to marry, and he was feeding them. And, so he attracted a large following of, what I mean?
Yes.
Now, how did the name Boko Haram evolve? The name Boko Haram evolved because in his preachings, he kept insisting that it is only an Islamic state governed by Sharia, through Sharia, that will bring about equity, uproot corruption. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Uproot corruption. So the idea now, most of his emphasis was that it was because Nigeria embraced Western democracy, Western political thinking, Western technology, Western culture. Those were the things that more or less corrupted the true Islamic society. So if we want to remove corruption from the society, we need to go back to practicing Sharia in its real form. You know what I mean? We practice Islam in its real form. Now we can uproot corruption. We can bring in equity. We can bring, what I mean?
Yeah.
So because he leaned toward or against Western culture,
Yeah.
it was people in the community that now started referring to them as Boko Haram. Oh, you know what I mean? That because he was against Westernization, so they started calling their group Boko Haram group. That was how that name came. It wasn't they that gave them. It was a community member that started saying, this one's a Boko Haram free. This was so, and the names became, stock, and so most people don't know that the real name is, the congregation, for preaching, through preaching and what combat, Jamatu al-Sun did the out is what had it. So now you find, an abbreviation where you have JAS. That's what it means. Jamatu al-Sunnah. What? That's the short form. So when you're reading things and you see JAS, it's actually Boko Haram, but they're referring to as JAS.
Okay. So at what point did Boko Haram as a group begin to adopt violent tactics?
Well, so this is the issue. First and foremost, you must realize, I was perhaps the first person to have written on Boko Haram, in 2009 when the group started. And why did I write about it? My position had always been that the state is the number one terror group. Forget it. You say this is a state constitutionally, entrenched, but the state is the number one terrorist organization. Forget.
Oh, interesting.
Now, why? It was the terror that was meted out to his own followers and later to himself that actually brought us to where we are today.
Wow.
You understand? And so when the state becomes lawless and becomes a terror group, we always want to shift blames and put blames on non-state armed actors who later became armed because of, the deficiencies that we have in state governance. And how did I come to that conclusion? Now, this was a group. There are political undertones which we may not go into because there's a lot of denial and all kinds of things, but everybody knows there is some kind of political undertone, between Sharif, who was the governor at that time, and even Muhammad Yusuf, you know what I mean? They were working together. Sharif actually used that group to clinch power in 2003 from Malaka Chanda and promised them that he was going to institutionalize Sharia as they wanted. So they supported him. And that was why when he became governor, he brought one of their members to become the Commissioner for Religious Affairs. But when they realized that he was not implementing Sharia as they had expanded, as he promised them, then they started falling out. So there's that side, which is very known to everybody. The other side is it is the injustice of the state that has brought Boko Haram to where it is. Now that's the truth. Let us not deceive ourselves. First and foremost, you had an altercation, in July 2009.
Okay.
And how did it start? It started with just like the kind of revolution that took place, in Tunisia, with the police harassing a young man. That was how it started. They lost one of their members and they were trying to go and bury him on their Okadas and whatever. The police stopped them and started harassing them. Wow. They didn't wear helmets and started. So that was where the altercation started. Now, before you knew it, there was, you know what I mean? So for about 1 week, they had a crisis in that state. But the long and short of it was that when eventually Mohammed Yusuf was, arrested by the military and handed over to the police, the police carried out extrajudicial killing against him. Now, what was the funny story? You came out, dropped his body almost half naked on the street, riddled with bullets. Somebody who has a large following like that, riddled with bullets, and then you are telling the whole world that he wanted to escape from prison. Meanwhile, he was on handcuffs and leg chains. How can somebody who was on handcuffs and leg chains want to? So they riddled his body with bullets. And in fairness, his members went to court. So that's a story that people don't talk about. His members went to court, and the court gave a verdict, accused the Nigerian state of, terrorizing the group because they had demolished even his school, demolished his mosque, demolished his base. And the court said, okay, the government must go back and rebuild those facilities because it was unjustly done, and then must pay compensation to all the members that were killed. The government refused to do that. It refused to do that. So the guys just simply went So for about 1 year, it was a silent group, not knowing that people had already been mobilizing until it started launching those attacks that you mentioned. So it was actually the action of the state. If the state had carried out, was lawful, obeyed the rule of law, rebuilt the school and the mosque for them, and they paid some compensation and then brought those who did that to justice.
Yeah.
I don't think we would have had the issue of Boko Haram. But because the state would terrorize and say, okay, you can go to places. And that is where we are.
Interesting. So with the passing of Muhammad Yusuf,
Yes.
Shekau took over.
Yeah.
What would you say are the leadership styles?
Well, everybody knew that Muhammad Yusuf was more a liberal and accommodating person. As a matter of fact, even when Muhammad Yusuf was alive, they had some few disagreements because Shekau, it was more or less like what, when OPC was formed by Frederick Fashow, and then you saw the Gani Adams group saying that Frederick Fashow's group, were a compromise group. So Gani Adams group became more militant. Now that was what Shekau wanted. He felt like Muhammad Yusuf was more like a docile person. And although, of course, he respected him, but immediately Muhammad Yusuf died and he took over. The dynamics changed.
Interesting.
Completely, because he was more a militant person. So why? Now, there's something that may not make meaning scientifically, but it makes meaning, to those who have some strong belief, in the area of belief system. Shekau was said to have been somebody who was selling turare, turare?
Yes.
As perfumes, these local perfumes. Now, in some traditions in the north, believe that anybody that is associated with that kind of trade would attract a lot of spirits. You know what I mean?
Yes.
They will attract a lot of evil spirits. So most people who knew Shekau will tell you that he was not mentally stable. You understand? That he was governed by spirits because of his trade. Do you understand? Well, that's why I say it's not scientific. But we can't ignore what people believe, so. And that's what a lot of people also don't understand. So, Shekau was more a violent person. And of course, by the time he took over the leadership, the Nigerian state felt it.
From what I understand, Muhammad Yusuf was quite educated.
Very well, in terms of Islamic education, yes.
Or not necessarily.
Well, I have not known there were some kind of contradictions. You had some people say he had some certificate in Abi Zaria. You had all kinds of things, but he was educated really.
Okay.
In terms of Islam.
Because it challenges the stereotype that terrorism appeals only to uneducated people, illiterate people. Or here you have someone like Muhammad Yusuf was quite...
No. It's forget it. You see, those are the kinds of naive thinking that people. Terrorism has nothing to do with education. In fact, the most educated are the most terrorists.
That's interesting.
No, because when you go back to history of terrorism, the Jacobins in France were a group that was very, very educated. Do you understand? And so much later, I think it was one of those reasons that Nigerian state missed out, in terms of responding to Boko Haram violent activities. Because we saw them as, they always call them rat tags, people who didn't go to school. But how can people who didn't go to school be manufacturing explosives?
They manufacture themselves.
Yes. How can, we know at the time in the entire north, it was more or less a crime for you to be seen with fertilizer. Because they were using fertilizer to manufacture explosives.
Wow.
And then you say that if you see the way Boko Haram organizes itself, you think that is organized by people who didn't go to school.
Wow.
That will be very, you know what I mean? And that will be a simplistic thinking. And terrorist groups the world over are very, very sophisticated guys. They're not, so we were thinking that they were just the Almajiri people no, they were very sophisticated people. You had amongst them graduates, because when that group started and Muhammad Yusuf started attracting young people, in my article that I wrote, it was evident that a lot of graduates tore their Western certificates and joined that group.
Wow.
whether they are graduates of technology, they were graduates of social sciences, they tore their certificates and joined the. What was it that the Nigerian state was doing for them? It was not giving them jobs. People graduated 5 years, 10 years, they didn't have jobs. And then you have a young man here who was giving them hope. So a lot of people thought that Boko Haram was just, the group of riffraffs who didn't know anything. No, they were more sophisticated than most of us.
Boko Haram has largely restricted its operations within Northeast.
Yeah.
What are the social contexts in the Northeast that has led to that?
No.
Why not other regions per se?
No. Well, it was not as if they didn't make attempts to go to other regions. In the early days of Boko Haram, they actually even attempted to invade Kano. Okay. But you see, the cosmopolitan nature of Kano and the way Kano, that Kano is this epicenter of business in the north.
Yes.
So Kano is like Lagos. The Kano people had come from the beginning to reject Boko Haram because they felt like it was going to do a lot of destruction to their commerce or commercial activities. So Boko Haram was not given a breathing space. They understand. They actually made attempts. They also made attempts in Bauchi, was also resisted. You know what I mean? So they couldn't penetrate Jigawa, to a large extent. And in any case, because it started as a movement in Maiduguri, don't forget that there was a group that started before Boko Haram, and Muhammad Yusuf was actually part of that group. In fact, he was the youth leader for mobilizing for that. The group was known as the Afghanistan, the Taliban.
The same Taliban?
Yes, and they adopted the name the Taliban.
Okay.
But most people don't know that.
Wow.
That was a group that functioned between 2002 and 2003, but was quelled by the Nigerian state. They took up arms against the Nigerian. They started in a place called Kanama in Yobe State. And Muhammad Yusuf was actually from Yobe State. He was not even but he was Kanuri. And the Kanuri people, you find them in Yobe State, and then you find them in Borno State. You understand? So that Kanama was actually a community bordering Yobe State and Niger Republic. But it was very rich in fishing activities. And so this group went to Hijra, the Taliban. Now it coincided with the time that America invaded Afghanistan in 2003. So that's why they adopted the name, the Taliban. Now, but the Taliban, even for the group in Afghanistan, you see, people, they just look at the activities and then they don't look at the nominalism around the name. Talib means the youth in Arabic. Okay. So even the Taliban in Afghanistan was actually a youth movement, kind of attracting the young people to embrace Islam. So this group of people also now accepted the Taliban. A community of young people who wanted to go on Hijrah. They wanted to migrate from the adulterated world to a very puritanic community, or form a puritanic, because that's why they moved out of whatever and then moved to Kanama, which is at the fringes. In fact, before you get to that place, maybe you have to even go to the Niger Republic. And then, so there was this conflict over scarce resources. They wanted to take over the control of the fishing ponds. That was some altercation. And then they attacked a police command and then took over the arms. Then before you know it, they took up arms against Nigeria. So Obasanjo actually came heavily on them. So most of them ran to Maiduguri. They were chased, and then they went to the Gembu Mountains in Maiduguri. They were flushed out. Muhammad Yusuf actually belonged to that group. It was after the leader of that group died, I think in that that he now formed his own, the Amatul al-Sunnah leader, what is what he had.
Interesting. Boko Haram also operates across the Lake Chad Basin region.
Oh, well, of course, it's not, that is his own territory.
Okay, so why is that? Despite the linguistic diversity of that region, how are they able to literally operate across the entire region?
The commerce has no language. You know what I mean? The Lake Chad Basin is one of the unfortunate things that have happened to Nigeria, Niger Republic, and Cameroon and Chad. As at 1970, that lake, yes, was estimated to have provided subsistence, to about 60 million people.
Right.
The shrinking of that lake is part of the conflict. So Boko Haram needed to take control of that lake because of the commercial activities. So if you take fishing, for example, they made a lot of fortune out of fishing. And today you find people accusing the military and security for taking over that waste from Boko Haram and making a lot of fortune out of it. Because if you go to Lake Chad Basin, and there's the border to Chad.
Yes.
On a daily basis, it was estimated that more than 100 trucks would leave, the lake for fishing across. And you know what that means. So if you take fishing activities alone, it gave employment to millions of people. Do you understand? So you have those that were doing nets, those that were doing hooks, those that were doing boats,
yes,
those that were fishing, those that were smoking, those that were, their own was just to provide basket and carton to package the fish. Those that were loading, you know what I mean? So it was a chain of activities. That's just fishing alone, apart from the irrigation activities that also took place. You cannot fight terrorism or you cannot fight a war without sufficient economy and food security. As I was Boko Haram was, so that's why when people are saying that they are not thinking, I just look and laugh.
Yeah.
So Lake Chad was a strategic, and it was from all angles. Because they can get the resources, whether they are in Cameroon, whether they are in Chad, whether they are in Nigeria, whether they are in Nigeria. So as a matter of fact, there was a time that Boko Haram took over more or less the pepper and tomato markets in Niger and Chad. People didn't know, but all of this came from Lake Chad. And onions, in order to raise resources for their activities. So why would it not be a strategic resource for them?
How would you rate the assistance of the international community in the fight against terror in Nigeria?
Well, first and foremost, let us say, the Nigerian state itself did not define Boko Haram as a terrorist group until America did.
Okay. Was that a strategic thing?
But it has a lot of implication in the way even the military will handle its operation. Because the artillery, the heavy machines that you need to fight a terrorist group, you can't deploy that on people that are not declared terrorists. That was why the Nigerian state missed it from the beginning. So they just saw it like, okay, some kind of soft thing. Let's just, you know what I mean? So meanwhile, they were bringing outdated guns and whatever that once they were hot, the chambers were seized. And Boko Haram was using AK-49. The latest technology. So the refusal to have declared it a terrorist group from the beginning had a lot of implication for what we are experiencing today. So until the American Congress declared it, that was when Nigeria came back. You know what I mean. So it's an unfortunate thing, but of course you may not blame those in government, and because you see, the government's position will always be that why do you take pleasure in killing your own citizens? But they have turned against the state, and they are also killing other citizens. They are also killing citizens who are Nigerian citizens. You know what I mean? So it was more or less like a dilemma for the Nigerian state. So why would we want to kill our young people? And because they took up arms against us. So Nigeria wanted to just be diplomatic in handling the situation. And don't also forget, politics came into it, where people started saying that they were killing Muslims, including Buhari made that statement.
Yeah, I think I remember
that they were killing Muslims, that kind of a thing. They were killing Muslims, and they were killing. So when you have a complex society like Nigeria, you have to be then careful as a government on how to handle things. But leadership is not also about being careful all the time. It's doing the right thing. When you need to be firm, you are firm. Forget it. You understand? Because the same Buhari came, as a matter of fact, came more heavy or heavier than what Jonathan did on Boko Haram. Yet was the same person who said they were killing Muslims. So was just a lot of things.
Would you say the emergence of Boko Haram led to the springing up of other terrorist groups like ISWAP, like Lakurawa, you know?
No,
And
well,
there's another terrorist group I read about, Ansaru, is not very famous. So, like, would you say the emergence of Boko Haram led to all these other terrorist groups?
I really wouldn't say, but I can speak for the Ansaru group. So the Ansaru group was actually championed by this first son of late Muhammad Yusuf. Because I did a transliteration of his speeches. So, when Boko Haram started, people thought that it was against Christianity because they were bombing churches. They were, you know what I mean? Much later, when Shekau took over, more Muslims and mosques were destroyed by Shekau's Boko Haram than yes. So the Albanawi, who adopted the name Albanawi as Muhammad Yusuf's son, created a splinter group referred to the Ansaru.
Okay.
But they would not support a position where Muslims were attacked. Their mission was not to attack Muslims. So they differed and disagreed with Shekau's style. And that was what led to the creation of Ansaru.
Okay.
You understand? Now, whether it's Islamic State in West African province, is actually Boko Haram. You see, at the point they first adopted ISIS, then they went to ISIL. You know what I mean? Then they went to ISWAP. All of this was strategic moves by the group in order to gain support of other terrorist group, bigger terrorist groups the world over. Okay. You know what I mean? So it's like when Al-Qaeda started, Bin Laden's Al-Qaeda started, then you had Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which is an affiliate of Al-Qaeda from Mauritania, Algeria, Mauritania, way down to the Sahel. That is actually what they wanted to do, so that they can have financial and material support and logistic support from the larger terrorist bodies. But to a large extent, you could say Nigeria actually gained from that, because it was actually the Ansaru group that became more or less like ISWAP, if you want to say, that eliminated Shekau. They were the ones who subdued the Shekau's group. And Shekau had to blow himself. When they surrounded him, they wanted to take him live. They had killed most of Shekau's followers. So Nigerian state gained from that division. You know what I mean? To a large extent.
Ironically. Would you say the lethality of Boko Haram has been contained largely?
Well, of course, it's very obvious. Is it not obvious?
Okay.
There is fatigue in fighting a war. There is whether you'll be able to sustain it by gaining resources. So now that they have been dislodged, and I'm trying to write a new article, and I actually started that thinking, some of the places that I gave some talks. I said, look, we did not have a containment plan when the Nigerian state was carrying out offensive against Boko Haram. We didn't have. The Nigerian state didn't have. It was only interested in bombing, you know what I mean, dislodging. But you see, when you study a tree that has the capacity of seeds to disperse, you know what I mean? Yes. So on the branches, the seeds will just break, and move. Then they'll start forming another, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So birds will come and pick the seeds and then go and drop somewhere. That's exactly what happened. Because we didn't have a containment plan. They were already operating in a region. So what the Nigerian state needed to have done was to make sure that they didn't go beyond that region. They were operating in Zambisa. What the Nigerian state was to make sure that they held them. But there was loose thinking. And then this group started filtering. They started filtering to all parts. So now they came to Birnin and took over. And why did they do that? They were targeting forests not because of, safety issues, but because of raising funds. Most of those forests are endowed with natural minerals. When you look at the whole crisis between Birnin-Gwari and Kaduna State, spanning through Niger State, through Katsina and Zamfara State, the Boko Haram guys were able to disperse themselves and filter now, met some bandits groups, carried out offensive against, killed several bandits, and took over the illegal mining activities that were happening in order to raise resources. So they now entered into a truce with the bandits that were mining. That was what stopped this. So there is a combination of terrorists and bandits in most of those forests now. And it's all about taking over the resources, which the Nigerian state refused to man for a long time in order to support their activities.
When I look at groups like the Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, they've been around for many decades, and the international community has not been able to defeat them totally.
Terrorists cannot be defeated like that.
So we just say Boko Haram would be like that for Nigeria.
For as long as
wants to stay.
For as long as that group, to a large extent, for me, has come to stay. It's not that terrorists don't win, terrorist group, and it's only the only resources are their oxygen. And so once they don't get those resources, they tend to, so what you are likely to find is that it will give the impression that it has disappeared. At some point in time, there will be a resurgence or resuscitating. You know what I mean? The terrorist group the world over are like that. The American state started supporting the Taliban to fight the Russians in 1979. Now, Taliban turned against the Americans. You know what I mean? And then we're receiving the support of Russia. Do you understand? But it was a creation of the American state to fight the influence of the Russians in 1979. They are still there. You know what I mean? Yes. So they are still there. The Zionist group that you have in Israel, and operated since 1948, is still there. You understand? So Al-Qaeda, since Bin Laden, is still there. Yes, it's been weakened. Do you understand what I'm doing? So that's when people are saying, and the Nigerian state cannot, they refuse to end Boko Haram. How can it end it? It's an ideological movement. The movement can only end itself when it decides to end itself. Yes, it will be incapacitated if it's denied access to resources and access. But the fundamental thing that we should have done to have allowed the thing, because the complexity of Boko Haram, and that was why it was able to. The Boko Haram was very, very strategic. It was using different tactics to recruit different young people. When you get to Adamawa State, for example, it's received a large following from the north of Adamawa. More or less from Michika, you know what I mean, to Madagali, to Gulak, way down to, because they share forest, we share boundaries with Zambisa Forest. Do you understand? So most of their farms are inside Zambisa Forest. So what did they do? When they got to Madagali side, there's a group of young people in that place that were considered like outcasts. And they were mostly blacksmiths and laborers, these low workers. Do you understand? So there was actually a caste system. The people didn't know in the upper part of Adamawa State. So when Boko Haram came, they decided to now bring those caste guys and make them the emirs. So you can see, very strategic. So those ones now turned against groups that were terrorizing them or rather were oppressing them. Yeah, they still do understand.
Yeah.
So in some places they didn't use religion. In some places they used the social structure in the society.
Lastly, are there any books you can recommend if someone wants to read more about Boko Haram?
No, it's a lot of books, especially the works by Zen. Zen has written about 2 or 3 books on Boko Haram. And Zen, I think, is I believe that maybe it's associated with the American CIA actually, because it's receiving a lot of support to do research on conflict issues, which the United States will not do. Now, when Buhari came, in his speech, he said the Nigeria needed to do a sociological study on Boko Haram. Nothing has happened till now. Sociological study would mean that you commission the universities to do an in-depth research, on the social structure of a group. Nothing has happened. So it is the Americans, the French people that are now sponsoring their own children to come and carry out research and then writing whether the stories are founded or not founded. They are now the leading scholars because they are the ones that have the research grants to do that. So Zen has written, Nigeria has not, look at the universities that are in the Northeast. So even if you say you don't want to come to Ibadan, you have a Center for Peace and Security Study in Modibo, Adama. The University of Maiduguri just established another Center for Peace and whatever. I'm sure the Nigerian state has not a single penny supporting the centers to do studies on groups.
That's an indictment on the Nigerians.
No, it's also because they are not interested. So you wait until the Americans come and do research, then you'll be saying the Americans say, the French, they say, the Germans, it's an unfortunate thing. People don't realize that there is no society that can develop that will renegade its own academia. You won't go anywhere, sure. Because knowledge is the driving force for everything. Whether you say it's technology, whether, you know what I mean? Yes. So if you have relegated and neglected your academic community, where are you then going to?
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks very much for this short session.